Hello, my name's Steve North, and the title of the talk today is Creature Roboethics, Robotic Creatures and Animats. Do we only have to treat them well if they're smart or because of what they represent? We're going to start by looking at this video. This is from the robotics company Boston Dynamics, and it's a kind of compilation of examples of what might be regarded as being abusive robotic creatures. And it's notable how many times humans seem to feel the need to kick them again and again. It's obviously justified as an attempt to destabilize them. But as we watch this, they seem to really quite revel in trying to knock them over. And there's something quite alarming about seeing a robot that's simulating a quadruped, looks very much as though it has some sort of life in it, trying to regain its feet and simulating bullfighting. Again, kick. And it just as part of this presentation is focused on how this might in some way impact the way which real non-human animals are treated by us if we start to find it acceptable to treat the robots in that way, and how this might mean that actually it matters very little what their level of intelligence, sentience, self-awareness, etc. is. It could be more about what it does to us and the example it sets to others if we think that kind of treatment is okay. And on and on, and now he's pushing instead of kicking. Some of these are obviously more humanoid robots, but quite a lot of them, for practical reasons, Boston Dynamics make things like robotic creatures that they call mules. They developed one for the US Army, which was intended to be a pack-carrying animal. But obviously they also work in humanoid forms as well. And again, now we're shoving over co-workers. And the obvious intention of this is to see how well the programming in the robot recovers from interruptions, but you can't help but feel that there's something slightly gleeful about the level of mistreatment. Pushing down on their face. And this is a very kind of non-human animal in its movements and behavior. So now let's pull it by the tail, because it seems to be fine to pull robot dogs' tails. Okay, so to provide a little bit more background context, I'm going to look at some recent headlines and polls that were conducted in the UK. A 2019 headline titled "YouTube removed videos of robots fighting, calling it animal abuse," and the company quoted the policy that prohibits videos, quote, "where animals are encouraged or coerced to fight by humans," unquote. Now this was presented as being in much of the media as being ridiculous and an overreaction, as these were kind of only loosely speaking robots that were intended to resemble creatures. But it was very interesting to see that the company felt a need to respond to complaints about the video and to implement that particular policy. A 2018 YouGov poll with 2,041 respondents reported that 1 in 10 25 to 34-year-olds could imagine a romantic relationship with a robot. And 1 in 5 young Brits can imagine being friends with a robot. And a third of Brits would be ruder to a robot providing poor service than a human, which again touches on some of this, how we treat them and whether it matters. Obviously this wasn't specifically about robotic creatures, but much of the same ideas apply there, and it's still relevant. So moving into the world of fiction, I'm going to look at the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. coined in 1942. Number 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. So that was in 1942 in a short story called Runaround, first published in Astounding Science Fiction, but republished many times. And before we start to look at the terms and define them for this, such as robotic creature and animats, I'm introducing this because I'm thinking that I will, at the end of the presentation, introduce my own ideas of laws that we might apply to robotic creatures. So these are a slightly drier and more contemporary set of rules. These were drawn up by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in 2011. It was in conjunction with the AHRC as well, so that's the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Robots should not be designed solely or primarily to kill or harm humans. Humans, not robots, are responsible agents. Robots are tools designed to achieve human goals. Robots should be designed in ways that assure their safety and security. Robots are artifacts. They should not be designed to exploit vulnerable users by evoking an emotional response or dependency. It should always be possible to tell a robot from a human. It should always be possible to find out who is legally responsible for a robot, and that last one is particularly relevant. So at the end of this, I'm gonna try and put together my draft 3 laws for preventing humans from harming biological or synthetic others. And in this case, that's robotic creatures. So a bit of term definition. What are roboethics, robotic creatures, and animats? Roboethics is the deals with ethical problems that occur with robots, such as posing a danger to humans, etc. Or the ethics of human behaviour towards robots, which is much less addressed area and perhaps something I'm more touching on here in connection with robotic creatures. Robotic creatures are robotic non-human animals, and it could cover a wide range of applications. They might not actually replicate existing animals. They could be fantasy, it could be a robotic unicorn, but the implication is that they are creatures, they're not human animals. Animats are artificial animals, and it's a contraction of animal materials. The term includes physical robots and virtual simulations. So animat research, which is a subset of artificial life studies, has become popular since Rodney Brooks' seminal paper, Intelligence Without Representation. And the word was actually coined by S.W. Wilson in 1985 in a paper called Knowledge Growth in an Artificial Animal, which was published in the very first proceedings of an international conference on genetic algorithms and their applications. So why might we wish to carefully consider our treatment of and social interaction with robotic creatures? Well, there's their ability to understand what's happening to them, their ability to suffer through pain mapping that has itself been added by humans. That's to say, the programming determines what the animal's sensational feelings are, and these can be adjusted. How it might impact our treatment of non-robotic creatures, including humans. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether the robotic creature is necessarily intelligent or able to understand or able to suffer, or is in fact fictional. If it's about the legitimacy that we actually give to a behavior towards them. So is it intelligence that we should consider when discussing their ability to understand suffering? We have to say that intelligence is not the same as sentience, being the ability to perceive or feel things, or consciousness, awareness of one's body, and self-awareness, which is recognition of that very consciousness. So a robotic creature might match human intelligence, but it might still lack these important capacities. And looking at the bottom of this slide, if human mistreatment of robotic animals is legitimized, what might the impact be on respect for biological creatures? You notice I've used robot animals, they're not robotic creatures, but I mean the same thing. Descartes' non-human animals as autonomous, bringing all that up again. If an ethical disregard to robotic creatures is normalized on the basis that they're actually soulless machines, then this runs the risk of legitimizing and reawakening Descartes' view that animals cannot reason and do not feel pain. And Descartes argued that other animals, non-human animals, are in fact no more than automata. So, does it really matter if robotic creatures are intelligent, sentient, conscious, self-aware, or any of those combinations? If our senses and emotions, and that's something that we're particularly looking at in this workshop on extended sociability, convince us that robotic creatures are real, does it really matter if they aren't real? So I'm going to touch now on something from my own work and my work with the EASE group. And it's about an individual's capacity to understand the implications of suffering. I'd like to propose that suffering, or to have an interest in not suffering, is the only capacity by which ethical significance should be weighed. I've chosen to phrase this as follows. More than anything else, an individual's ability to understand their circumstances may be the appropriate way to weigh up a relative experience of suffering. The ability for an individual to understand suffering and its implications for them is likely to be determined by their individual experiential learning, their personal cognitive and physical life stories, their ability or their challenges to their ability, their age, etc. One or more of these factors may increase or decrease an individual's experience of suffering. It's further argued that species-specific characteristics only offer a very coarse level tool which perhaps should be only applied when all attempts to know the individual are impossible. There's something called species overlap, where you can't actually be sure around the edges of species. You can't draw a firm barrier between them and determine with any clarity what their capacities are. If a being is considered to suffer equally, unless further contextualizing information can be found, then substantial or even equal ethical significance must be given to a non-human individual of any species, and in that I would argue should be included AIs and robotic creatures with significant capacity. And who is the human that gets to judge an individual's capacity to understand suffering? I've got concerns that the idea that each human will eventually achieve sufficient moral vision to weigh up the competing capacities to suffer. But assuming that an experienced, impartial, rational human can be tasked with judging relative suffering, then the criterion used to weigh significance might be an individual's ability based on personal, not species, or whether they're synthetic or biological characteristics, to interpret the implications of their suffering. So thinking a little bit now about just smart enough to suffer, one would assume that robots might necessarily not need to experience pain or any sort of simulation of pain, but actually there are huge human advantages to doing so. And we create pain and pleasure maps in robots which can be edited to determine how they experience things and how these rewards might fit into their programming and their learning to improve their behavior and be more useful to humans. A 2019 news item from the Technical University of Munich appears under the headline, "Biologically inspired artificial skin improves sensory ability of robots." And it goes on to say that, quote, "sensitive synthetic skin enables robots to sense their own bodies and surroundings, a crucial ability if they are to be in close contact with people." Inspired by human skin, a team at the Technical University of Munich has developed a system combining artificial skin with control algorithm and used it to create the first autonomous human robot with full body artificial skin, unquote. This is why I would argue we will inevitably make robot creatures that can feel pain. We've already started to do it because it keeps them safe with obvious economic advantages and helps robots to avoid accidentally injuring humans. Electronic personhood. So this is mainly concerned with whether it is machines or human beings that should bear ultimate responsibility for the actions of robots. Electronic persons is a term first proposed by the European Parliament's Committee on Legal Affairs in a draft report on civil law rules on robotics, which was dated 31st of May 2016. The proposed legal status for robots would be analogous to corporate personhood, which allows firms to take part in legal cases both as the plaintiff and the respondent. The term is used to describe the potential legal status of the most sophisticated autonomous robots, so they may have specific rights and obligations, including that of making good any damage that they cause and applying electronic personality to cases where robots might make smart autonomous decisions or otherwise interact with third parties independently. So really, such discussions claiming to explore robot rights are being driven by the interest of the companies and corporations that own them. George Dvorsky, who's a bioethicist, transhumanist and futurist, he's the former chair of the board for the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which is IEET, and the founder and chair of the IEET's Rights of Non-Humans Persons program, a group that's working to secure human equivalent rights and protections for highly sapient animals. Dvorsky drew up a robot rights manifesto to be applied to all robots that are said to pass the personhood threshold. The manifesto states that the more advanced robots and AIs should have the right not to be disabled against their will, the right fully to know their own source code, the right not to have their source code changed against their will, the right to self-duplication or to refuse to be duplicated, and the right to privacy of their own internal mental states. There are now many efforts to grant personhood rights to non-human animals, such as great apes, elephants, whales and dolphins. The intention is to protect them against such things as undue confinement, experimentation and abuse. Unlike efforts to legally recognise corporations as persons, this isn't some kind of legal loophole. The proponents of these proposals are making the case for authentic personhood for the benefit of the individual. That's personhood based on the presence of certain cognitive abilities such as self-awareness. So I'm going to look again very briefly at Asimov's 3 laws. This is just to remind you before I launch into showing you what I'm proposing. And this is slightly tongue-in-cheek and not fully developed. It's just a draft to reflect what I've tried to address in this presentation. So this is Steve's 3 laws for preventing humans harming biological or synthetic others, and in this case that's robotic creatures. 1, a human may not, except in cases of self-defense, physically or mentally harm a biological or synthetic other who suffers and or is cognitively able to understand the implications of the inflicted harm. 2, a human may not, except in cases of self-defense through inaction, and that reflects something in Asimov's 3 laws, allow physical or mental harm to a biological or synthetic other who suffers and or is cognitively able to understand the implications of the inflicted harm. 3, even where a biological or synthetic other is demonstrably incapable of suffering and or not capable of understanding the implications of the inflicted harm, a human may not, except in cases of self-defense, physically or mentally harm or simulate harming, such as kicking robots over, as we saw in the video at the beginning, this other, where to do so might appear to legitimize the infliction of harm on others of a similar type, by implying that they categorically lack the ability to experience and understand suffering. So, to try and put this into some kind of conclusion, I would argue that we should consider giving ethical significance to robotic creatures because 1, they might have the capacity to understand the implications of their suffering through any combination and varying level of intelligence, sentience, consciousness and self-awareness, and that this remains true however artificial their experience of suffering might appear to us. 2, even if they demonstrably don't have the capacity to understand their suffering, we risk legitimizing harm being done to biological creatures and reawakening Descartes' view of non-human biologicals as being mere automata. And I've included some references here. I'll leave this up for a minute, but it's probably not quick enough for you to actually get them. So if you want them, you'll have to email me or ask me, or perhaps Ivan or somebody in connection with the workshop will put this up afterwards. And that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.